Hello class, this is Miss Roberts here, and tonight we're going to explore the first chapter, Interpersonal Processes, and we're also going to explore the basics of interpersonal communication and communication as a discipline. Now, the aim of this course is to help you communicate better not only as an individual, but with your interpersonal relationships, which can include your friends, family, and romantic partners. So let's begin. So first, let's explore why do we communicate. The book talks about the 4 reasons why we communicate. First, there are physical needs. So for instance, we need to tell people if we're sick. We need to know if others are doing well. We need to make sure and communicate that we're safe. Those are some of our basic needs that we have as human beings. So communication helps us with physical wellness, health, safety, and making sure that our environments and world is safe around us. Next, we have identity needs. So when we communicate, one of the first things we might tell someone is our names. Our names is just a basic part of our identity. We also might talk about our cultures, our hobbies, our majors, things that give people an understanding of who we are. And we also use communication to help understand others and their identity. Next, there's social needs. So as human beings, we have the psychological and sometimes physical need to be around others. Think about, why do we feel lonely? If we didn't need interaction and social contact, loneliness might not be a thing. So with social needs and interacting with others through communication, we're able to be physically and mentally healthy. We're able to share ideas, share love, share contact, and that would make us healthier and happier. Next, we have practical needs. So say if you need to find directions, or you need to find where a bathroom is, or you need to find out where food is. Communication helps us navigate our day-to-day lives. Now, if you can recall from the content discussion, I posted the transactional communication model where you have 2 speakers, interaction messages, and one of your assignments is to create short scripts where you label the different parts of the communication model. But where did that model come from? Some of the earlier models resembled a more of a linear approach where they had one speaker say the message to the other speaker, and it didn't necessarily compensate or illustrate rather the interactions between 2 people. So it resembles an archer shooting the message at a target instead of an exchange. And the exchanges don't necessarily have to be verbal. They can also be verbal and nonverbal. But with the transactional communication model, and as demonstrated in our content discussion, senders and receivers are sending information back and forth. And that can be verbally or non-verbally demonstrated. So let me go ahead and explain this model. That's why I show the faces versus the more egg eye type of illustration here. But these 2 represent speakers, and each speaker communicates, sends, and receives messages, encoding, decoding messages, and we're assigning meaning and trying to decipher what's being said to us. And people are doing the same thing when we're talking to them. Now, these colored spaces are the different environments. In communication, we can be in the same room or the same area, same space, or we can be in different spaces. We can even communicate in the same times or different times. You may have heard the words asynchronous and synchronous. That's what we're referring to. Are we interacting at the same time, more synchronously, or asynchronously? One person communicates at one time, and the other person responds after the fact. Now we have different channels that carries the messages. The message is exactly what's being said, and the channels are in which those messages are being transmitted. So, for example, we have verbal communication, technologically based communication, social media, text messaging, video. We have the telephone, letters, different ways that we communicate messages to each other. Now these squiggly lines can be referred to as noise. Now some models refer to those as interrupters, but there's two aspects or two facets of the noise or interrupters. So for example, you can have internal noise and external noise. Internal noise is more psychological. So say if you're in the middle of class and there's a lecture, but it's an 8 o'clock lecture and you're really hungry and you're like, oh, I'm so hungry, and it's hard to understand what the teacher is saying. Or maybe you're very sleepy during those times. That state of mind or state of being and those thoughts drifting away is an interrupter between you and the lecturer. But there can also be external noise, just like that. So external noise is actually physical noise that is impeding you from hearing and understanding and or paying attention to the message. So that's why that noise is represented by these squiggly lines, just sort of interrupting the message here. So with the transactional communication model, we know that sending and receiving messages are simultaneous. Meaning exists in and among people, so the people in the conversation is unique and they understand each other, or if they don't understand each other, they can go more into detail, but the people who are communicating, or the persons that are communicating, are in their own little bubble, they're in their own little circle at that moment. Like we just demonstrated, environment and noise can affect communication. Channels can make the difference. Some people have preferences between technological mediated communication versus face-to-face. They both have pros and cons, but they can make a difference in how much information you can gather from the exchange or how little. So let's explore some communication principles. Communication in and of itself is transactional. So for example, there's an exchange going on. That's why they had to go from the linear to the more transactional model of communication. Each speaker influences each other at the moment, whether it be mood, whether it be tone, whether it be situation, which causes more interdependent behaviors, and each exchange is uniquely created. So even though you might talk about the same things, if you talk about those things with different people or even at different times, the messaging or the impact might be a little different. You can communicate something intentionally. That's what we aim to do. However, we can also have unintentional communication, right? You might say something that you might not mean, or you might be saying something, but your facial expressions might be displaying a different emotion. We'll talk about nonverbal communication and emotions later on in the semester, but you can intentionally, of course, and unintentionally communicate just the same. One of the most fascinating parts of communication studies, and when I was in the beginning of my college journey, one of the things that we talked about how communication is irreversible. Think about it. Have you ever wanted to take back something that you said? I have, once or twice. Here's the thing. You can explain what happened. You can apologize for what happened, but you can't take it away. Once something is communicated out into the universe, whatever channels that may happen, you can't take it back. So, say for instance, if you follow those sorts of things, maybe tiffs between people on social media, or maybe an argument with someone that you had, or maybe something that you wanted to say, you said it and didn't come out the right way. Once those things are out there, you can't take them back, but you can explain them, and hopefully the other person will be like, hey, I forgive you. Next, communication is unrepeatable. Next, communication is unrepeatable. Well, wait a minute. I just repeated that. So, of course, I can repeat the message, but the impact of that repeated message may be different. So, for example, you might ask someone to repeat something again because you didn't understand. Okay, so the second time the message is repeated, you might gain clarity, or you might respond differently than the first time you heard it. So it can be repeated, but the impact is not repeatable. Next, there are content and relational dimensions to communication. So just like we touched on earlier, the purposes of communication, content dimension refers to what's actually being said, and it doesn't necessarily have a relational or emotional component to it. Say for instance, if I ask someone, hey, what is your favorite sushi restaurant? There's no emotional baggage that comes along with that question. It might be an opinion, but we'll just go to the restaurant and that's it. So the content dimension is pretty straightforward, face value, doesn't necessarily have any emotional baggage. But if I take someone to that sushi restaurant and then ask them out on a date, that's when we get into the relational dimension. Relational dimension is communication that helps bring people together, express emotions, and helps with bonds, and it does have that emotional impact. Okay. Although communicating better is something that we aim to do, and the aim of this class, there are limits to communication. Let's explore those. All communication seeks understanding. Maybe not. I don't know if you've ever been through this or asked this of someone, but excuse me. But there might be a misunderstanding, and even if you explain your side, your perspective the best way you could, you might not meet in the middle. It's almost like the adage, we agree to disagree. So it's okay to express yourself and respect each other's opinion, but sometimes communication is just for expression in and of itself and not necessarily to dive deeper and understand, but you can. More communication is always better. Have you ever gotten in trouble and you tried to explain what happened, but as you explained what happened or your intentions and motivations, you just got into more trouble? That's one example of communication not always being better. Sometimes you might need to take a break from communication or let the other person process what happened, but sometimes the more you talk, the bigger hole you're digging. So definitely read the room. communication will solve all the problems in my relationship, or all my problems, right? Yes and no. Now, although good communication, strong communication, and mutual communication can help strengthen a relationship, communication without behavior modification or action behind all the talking might not do much. We're going to explore this a lot more in emotions and definitely in conflict resolution, in the conflict chapter, where we need a combination of communication and action to help solve problems and solve issues. And finally, effective communication is a natural ability. Everybody can do it. But if everybody can do it, why do we have communication studies classes? Was my major a lie? Just playing. Now, I'll give you an example of me as an instructor. So I'm pretty comfortable with teaching in front of classes. I'm getting more comfortable teaching in the digital space. But one thing that I've never done is teach a classroom of 100 people. Now remember, I am a communication studies and speech teacher. I've taught public speaking. You would think that I will have a more relaxed attitude no matter what size of the audience. But if I'm ever called to teach 100 students, I will feel a little bit nervous at the very beginning. Will I use my tools to overcome that nervousness? Of course. But that would be a more of an unnatural type of setting for me. So depending on the circumstances and the context, some people could communicate better than others. However, that doesn't mean you can't learn how to. Now let's talk about interpersonal communication. That's what you're here for. Now think about your three main groups: your friends, your family, and your romantic partners. Now interpersonal relationships differ from the other interactions you may have with coworkers or someone at the grocery store or maybe some online interactions because you guys have a unique relationship, a stronger bond. You're interdependent, so maybe you guys live together, or maybe you depend on each other for support and structure. You have more self-disclosure with your interpersonal groups. You have more trust. And hanging out with them and talking to them is a reward in and of itself. So with interpersonal relationships, we have stronger bonds. They're unique. We are linked in. They're part of our social network, our social fabric. We disclose more information to them, so there is trust involved. And we just feel good being around them. And we're going to explore these aspects a little bit more in upcoming chapters. So we touched on communication competence a little bit earlier. And we talked about, hey, there's a misconception that communicating is a natural ability. But, excuse me, there are two dimensions to effective communication. Competent communication rather. I apologize. There is effective communication. So does the message that you're communicating do what's supposed to do? So are you communicating effectively? Are you communicating clearly? And is it getting the results that you want? However, is this communication appropriate? Reading the room, right? So you might want to say whatever was on your mind, but there's definitely a time and a place to communicate those concerns. And if you're able to do both, then you are an effective a competent communicator in that context. So to be a competent communicator, it has to be effective, so you communicate what you need to, and appropriate. Is this communication appropriate for the situation. There's no one way to communicate. You have different ways, different styles. Try out what style is best for you, and always go back. Is it effective and is it appropriate? Competence is situational and can be learned. So, just an example I talked about earlier. I am comfortable with a 30 student classroom versus a 100 student classroom. But if they ask me to teach 100 students, okay, I'll do it. But it's something that I will have to learn how to do, because to deal with a smaller group, medium-sized group, or a larger group, there's different techniques. So that's a situation that I will have to learn how to do. So this particular model just talks about characteristics of social media and how it differs from face-to-face communication. When we talk about the leanness of social media, we talk about how much information from the interaction can we get. So with face-to-face communication, we can read facial expressions, we can hear the tone of our voice, we can see the whole body. Now with video interactions, helps compensate a little bit, but if you're just texting or just putting messages on social media, it might not be as robust as face-to-face contact. Here's that word again, asynchronous. Asynchronicity, excuse me, asynchronicity is not communicating at the same time. So with social media, we can communicate with each other at different times. But we can also communicate at the same time with lives and FaceTime and things like that. However, there is a permanence to social media. So for example, what you put out there, just like in the characteristics of communication earlier, what is put out there is out there forever. If you follow social media gossips columns like I do, when we say they pulled receipts, that means even though the celebrity might have deleted the content, some way the internet is able to screenshot and just pull things off the internet. So what is out there? It's out there. And finally, And finally, we're going to talk about how to communicate competently on social media. So just be careful what you post, be considerate. Remember, this is permanent. Be aware of getting into drama with bystanders, or just be aware that there are other people watching your social media, and just be mindful that it's not just an isolated incident. If you do get into it on social media, balance the face-to-face time. It might be more challenging than others, but with these, if possible, try to balance those things out and embrace the multiple ways to communicate, because we are communicating in a much more robust and rich and varied space and different times as before. All right. So that is the last slide in chapter 1. Thank you so much for being in my class, and thank you for hanging out with me for this chapter. Next time we will talk about communicating in cultures. So thank you so much and have a great evening. Bye.